Hello and welcome to this video on nationalism for your paper 2 non-core ideology. This will be an introduction to the core principles and ideas of nationalism as a whole. This is the core foundational knowledge that you just have to know about nationalism. So nationalism has 6 principles which we will focus on in this video. It has 4 strands and 5 thinkers. You will notice, hopefully, that there are 2 number 1s on the thinkers. That's because the thinkers align really well with the strands for nationalism. So liberal nationalism has Rousseau and Mazzini, conservative nationalism has Herder, expansionist nationalism has Maurras, and anti and post-colonial nationalism has Marcus Garvey. Firstly then, nations. Nation is the heart of politics for nationalism. So nationalism argues that political authority should reflect national identity. So that means the nation is treated as the primary unit of political organisation, which sets up quite nicely for that idea of self-determination. Because for nationalism, nations exist because people believe that they exist, that people believe that they form a nation. Unfortunately, that recognition, though, is not guaranteed by other people, is it? And that leads to conflict. So we could think of nations without a nation state. Kurds, Palestinians, Basques, those kinds of people. The nation also leads to multiple bases of national identity. So often they're based around language, so sharing a common language or common religion, common ethnicity, just these kind of cultural similarities. But it's not agreed by everyone. There's no real checklist for nationhood that everyone will accept. When it comes to things like identity and patriotism, ultimately nations are defined by a shared loyalty and emotional attachment. So patriotism is a common feature of nationalism, the idea that you have that psychological attachment to the nation. And as we've already discussed, you can be a nation without territory or statehood. Secondly then is this principle of self-determination. Essentially that is the idea that you should be able to rule oneself. And in nationalist thought that often refers to the desire of a nation, not just individuals, to be able to form this genuine political community and govern themselves. Nationalists tend to believe that only the nation itself can fully and properly define its national interests, and that external rule is seen as illegitimate because it cannot reflect the will of the nation. This is often linked to this idea of popular sovereignty, that political authority rests with the people, not with a monarch. And there's a shift from subjects to citizens. That's particularly seen in liberal nationalism. Some of the other strands of nationalism, particularly expansionist nationalism, has a slightly different take on that. It really appears, as the image suggests, in the French Revolution, where sovereignty came to reside in the French nation, in the people, not in the crown, that citizens are possessing of inalienable rights. And then it also developed a lot in the post-First World War climate, where President Wilson had his 14 points, and one of those 14 points that formed the basis of the League of Nations was around self-determination. Obviously, though, this is a major source of conflict because there's disagreement on whether a group qualifies as a nation, whether self-rule is being denied or threatened. So areas like Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Crimea and Russia right now, it illustrates that this can be a quite complex and quite disputed concept. Thirdly then, principle of nationalism is the nation state, which is different to a nation. So a nation state is when a nation achieves that status of governing itself within its own sovereign borders. It kind of puts a political structure on top of that idea of a nation. We've seen that historically where Germany existed as a nation but didn't obtain a nation status really until sort of 1871. We also see it in terms of independence movements where nations break away from states and empires, whether it be in post-colonial nationalism in the wake of the Second World War and the breakup of the European empires, but also the USSR breaking down and independent states appearing in Eastern Europe. So for nationalists, the nation state is really valuable because it promises political as well as cultural unity. It lends legitimacy to the government, and it links quite nicely to Rousseau, who's one of the nationalism key thinkers, who talks about the idea of a general will and the idea of sovereignty residing in the people. Obviously, though, within nationalism, there will be disputes about legitimacy and disputes about the nation state. And some nationalist movements actually settle for a bit of autonomy rather than independence. So you look at Wales. Wales does not have full independence, but Welsh nationalists have been looking for greater autonomy. Fourthly, then, is this idea of culturalism, and different strands of nationalism take this to different levels, as you would expect. But broadly, it's this idea that nationhood is kind of rooted in this organic, emotional community of shared culture. And often there's an aim to preserve that shared culture, to revive it, to strengthen it, and also using that as an emphasis to unify the people of that nation. It's often associated with Herder. Herder is essential to what we might call cultural nationalism. He's also the key thinker most associated with conservative nationalism. And his idea is of the Volksgeist, of the national spirit. Every nation possesses a spirit, and that spirit's revealed in the songs, the myths, the legends, the language of that nation. And historically, that has been used to justify a whole range of different ideas. It's been used to kind of justify independence movements, but it's also been used to justify more kind of nefarious and less desirable views. And actually, it can be quite exclusive culturalism. So there's a tension within nationalism of exclusion versus inclusion. At its extremes, then, when it's exclusive, it can lead to ideas of cultural superiority. Now, Herder himself rejects racial superiority, but actually that question about whether my culture is better than your culture comes into that idea of culturalism. But ultimately, it's about the preservation of national culture over kind of statehood, and it tends to be more exclusive. At number 5, we have the most controversial and most contested principle of nationalism, and one that many nationalists would disagree with. So liberal nationalism would absolutely reject this. This is racialism. Now, it's kind of pretty synonymous with racism today. It is essentially the belief that political or social conclusions can be drawn from supposed biological differences between races. There's kind of two assumptions here. Humans are divided into biologically distinct races, that it's an actual thing that exists biologically, and that these differences are politically and socially significant, and we can draw conclusions and make decisions based on it. This means then that identity is fixed. So unlike kind of culture or citizenship, race is unchangeable as physical characteristics that are defining features. This means it is very rigid, and it is by nature very exclusionary. Racial nationalism then means that the nation is defined solely by the race. It cannot be defined by shared values or culture. So belonging is determined by biology, not participation or not loyalty. And that's linked directly with, again, that spec key term of exclusive nationalism that's seen particularly in expansionist nationalism, though elements of it arguably creep in to conservative nationalism at its extremes. It's also really clearly linked to the 19th and 20th centuries imperialism, colonialism. The picture you see there is Cecil Rhodes bestriding Africa as he carries the white British culture across the empire. There's kind of an implicit racism in there. as well. And arguably this feeds into 20th century movements as well, like Nazism, where there's racial theory of inferior and superior races. Finally is this concept on principle of internationalism that again is debated and contested within different strands of nationalism. So generally it prioritizes cooperation over national boundaries. It might accept, particularly within nationalism, they will accept the existence of the state and the existence of those boundaries, but they will look to emphasize cooperation, particularly associated with liberal internationalism and socialist internationalism. So liberal internationalism would say that unchecked national power is dangerous even if we accept natural political units, and that there needs to be increased cooperation, increased interdependence. So that's ideas like free trade and cooperation across borders. So you might get supranational institutions like the United Nations and the League of Nations and the EU. So liberal nationalism is aiming to create a law-governed international system. A lot of emphasis on human rights. You get the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We get the European Convention of Human Rights as well. Socialist internationalism takes a slightly different approach. They again often see nationalism as quite divisive. They might even reject it entirely, dismiss it as kind of a right-wing idea. And so the internationalism comes in the form of class solidarity and shared class interests. You might have seen the poster, workers or working men of the world unite. Okay, the only thing you have to lose is the chains that bind you. An emphasis on a common humanity, shared human sympathy, and cooperation as well. So internationalism can coexist with nationalism, and liberal nationalists obviously accept liberal internationalism, but there is a level of controversy and debate, as there is with all of these principles. So to recap and to finish, we've looked in this video at the core principles and ideas of nationalism. We've looked at nations, we've looked at self-determination, we've looked at the nation state, we've looked at culturalism, racialism, and internationalism. And there's some summaries that you can pause and read through as you wish. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.